guess I'm seated, so it works well for the hybrid model. But yeah, we'll open up today's meeting of the Society of American Military Engineers, Rhine-Main Post. And since it's a hybrid meeting, I'll share that we have about 20 people in the room here in person at the DFAC of Clay Concern, plus one more coming through.
31 people online.
Yeah. Yes, hello. Welcome, welcome. Yeah. Sorry, we're just welcoming a few more guests. So thanks for joining. So yeah, so for those online, we have about 20 people in the room.
32 online.
Yeah, and then we have, for those of you in the room, we have about 32 online. And thank you, Colonel Gaffney, for joining.
Once I heard you were going to be here, I said, there's no way I can.
Okay, no pressure. Yeah. But yes, so also we have some of our board members here. We have some of our post members online, but I see we also have some other people here that maybe are not familiar with the CME. So just to explain that, yeah, our organization exists here to connect the DoD military mission that we're doing here in Europe with the military that's here, the civilian workforce, the local national workforce, and the architect engineer companies. Did it crash? No. That's okay. Yeah. Yeah, so it connects us all, one, to just form relationships so that when we're working together on projects, we have good relationships and solidarity together, but also to identify technical topics or engineering challenges that we've been noticing as we're executing projects, that we can come together and figure out a right way ahead. So once a month we have a meeting, usually on a technical topic. So last month was on like costs and forecasting, which is a very relevant topic after inflation. And then this week, we're still broadcasting, or?
We are.
Okay.
They can still hear
it's
you.
just we don't have it on.
The presentation is, we had to pull that back up.
Okay, got it. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, that's our post and what we do and why we meet once a month. So thank you for being a member and thank you for your attendance, which is even more important to form that engaged community. So today's presentation we'll start in maybe 10 minutes or so. We're just going to first do a few announcements from our Rhine-Main Post. Are those projecting? We need to
Coming up
this
right now.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, just a few technical things. We're going to share the slides, but basically we first have our post announcements because we are a functioning post and we have other initiatives. So we share those updates with our members. And then we get into the technical presentation around 12, which today it's on kind of the architect engineer company's role for AT in our projects to kind of set expectations. And for that, we have Mr. Achim Knackerstadt here from USACE, who's got a lot of experience, and then myself in my other role as civil engineer within U.S. Army Europe and Africa's anti-terrorism branch. So we'll brief this topic together because August is Army's anti-terrorism month. So good theme and venue. And we also hosted a training this week for security engineering training. Had about 45 engineers, DPW staff, and physical security from all over the theater here. Learning the basics. So it goes well together today. So with that, I will start our post announcements now that we have our slides up. So next slide, please. Yeah. I guess we still have some technical issues, but the next slide, so we can skip it later, is just the technical housekeeping stuff. Please mute your mic if you're not speaking, and then also that what's being shown and broadcasted here is being recorded so that it can be posted on YouTube for others to view later if you missed it or you'd like to reference it again. And as well as the slides will be posted on our website. So next slide, please. Just an overview. This is the post leadership from this calendar year. So any interest in a specific topic, please get in touch with us. Or if you're interested in helping or serving in the following year, also, we welcome you. Next slide, please. So with this, I turn it over to Tim.
So our programs, the remaining programs we have for 2023, for September, we'll have a STEM discussion, which is a priority item for our post streamer award presentation that we'll be giving there in September. In October, we have a pending topic that'll be announced pretty soon. In November, we'll be talking about cyber resiliency, which is also an important topic for the Post. And in December, you can wait to hear more about our holiday special that we're going to have. Scott, back to you.
All right. Thanks. Looking forward to the holiday special. All right. So Chris, are you online today?
I am.
Great.
Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining today. So the Rhine-Main Post has active 196 members, and we had actually 12 new members that joined the Post in 2023. And we also have, next slide, please. We have 26 companies that are sustaining members for the Post that renew for 2023, and we all thank you for this continuous and sustained support that makes this Post one a very successful one. So next slide just shows who these members are, and again, thank you so much for your support, and over to you.
All right, next slide, please. All right, Nick Irwin.
All right, I'll stand up, but I'm going to stay right here. Feeling a little bit of a hypocrite today because I hurt my back Monday and I'm feeling really old, but I'm the VP for Young Professionals. So I do want to continue to post this. This has been at the top of the slide since I wrote the slide a couple months ago, but the LDP program, Leader Development Program is coming up. So it'll be probably the next month or two that we need to get applications if you want to do the program. Brian's done the program. Scott, you've done the program. Nick talked about the benefits of the program. It's a year-long program with several large chunks of commitments. So you do need to think ahead if you want to do it, but it's a great opportunity. A couple other things I want to shout out this month. CME has a relatively new program for credentialing support. So if you are actively pursuing your architect or engineer license, they can help you pay for materials. They'll help you cover the test or for test prep courses. So that's an opportunity out there if you're at that point in your career. For government employees specifically, sorry, for all you industry folks, there's a similar thing for the PMP through AEITT. So both of those opportunities, there's a link to them there in the slide if you have the slide. Also, the big thing I want to do today is shout out for our next networking event. It's a Young Professionals hosted networking event, but I do want to remind everybody that it's open to anybody who wants to show up. We're going to meet down at Brewdog in Wiesbaden. If you don't know where Brewdog is, it's in the Fußgänger zone. And we're going to meet there at like 6 o'clock-ish for probably a good chunk of the night and just network, socialize, and have fun on the 14th of September. So I will try to put something else out. I will get with probably Charisse and put it on the Facebook site and also try to socialize it among USACE with me. And then I think a couple other people are on contact to try to socialize that. But please, if you are interested or you know people who might be, just pass the word out. All right. And as always, make sure to remember my email's on there. If you have questions or interest or anything, shout it out to me.
Yeah.
Back to you, Scott.
Thanks, Nick, especially for setting up the social event. Ryan and I will definitely hope to bring along some Otis Eng guys as well, and ladies. Next slide, please. All right, Britta.
That's not my first slide.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay,
If you have, you can just brief it then. Sorry.
okay. Let me find my current slide because now I don't remember. I had a whole list of things that we were doing.
Okay. Well, we can come back to it as you pull yours up
No,
then.
it's okay.
Okay.
Put that here.
I would say one thing with the programs. Yeah, we're all the way in July, and we see we don't have so many programs left for the year. It's been a good year. We've had good turnout, and I think interesting, relevant topics. But next year's coming. So if you have specific interests for what kind of programs, topics you'd like to have presented next year, or challenges that you've experienced in industry that we can come together and work together on, please email us with those, and we'll try to get a program for the next year. Okay, Britta.
I think everybody saw this from last month, but if not, we did award 3 scholarships for 2023. Our first place winner, Isabella Singleton, heading off to Columbia University to study aeronautical engineering. And Benjamin Garcia, left, I think, already last month. He had to do some I guess, I don't even know what they call them, at the Air Force Academy. Is it a plea? Well, pre-freshman year stuff. So he's already there, getting settled for the new year. And he will be studying computer science and computer engineering. And then Sydney Ryman will be heading off in a few weeks to Bristol, where she'll be attending the University of West England and studying architecture. So as part of my 90-day focus, which was what my slide was for this month, I'm going to be coordinating with them. I let them know that in the letter that I sent out to them, as well as some email correspondence that I had, in order to support them with their becoming student members of SAME. There's some benefits to that, some more that I learned about last month or whenever that was, a few weeks ago. I went to the new post leaders training workshop in Florida, and there's some additional programs that can support these students, including providing them a mentor locally or regionally. So continue to coordinate that with them and then schedule updates with them for sometime in the spring. My focus is also on getting back with the points of contact that I made last year for the K through 12 schools here in Wiesbaden and at Stuttgart, as well as Frankfurt International School. I want to remind them that we will have the scholarship again for next year, give them an update on sort of when to expect that the application will be posted and how long that will be open for, and also to get an idea from them on how we can support them in this coming year. We had talked about it with them last year. They seem to have a pretty good support network going, where they had a lot of local and regional engineers and others in the STEM field supporting their various programs, mentoring some of their students. So it didn't seem like they had a very great need last year. I'm hoping that's different this year. So I will provide an update on that next month as a part of the STEM session. And then I'm in the process of reviewing the scholarship application. I know there's some updates that need to be made to it. So I'll take care of that, and then establishing a schedule, which I'll bring back to the board just to review and approve and make sure that I'm on track with that. And that's all I have, unless there's any questions.
Thanks, Britta. You've really made a strong STEM program the last year. So
Working.
yeah. So thanks for your effort to sustain it and even make it better, it sounds like. Okay, Chandler, might you be online? And if not, no worries, I'll cover it. So yeah, our website is still the place to go to find out when our next event is, to sign up for the event, and to access content from the last presentations. And good news is the new website we've been talking about for, I don't know, a year now is finally launched. We were waiting on national, so now it's on our post to actually build it out. So you'll see some changes and some transitions that Chandler's working on, but you should still be able to get all the content. And yeah, the best other way to keep in touch with what's going on is the newsflash emails that if you're a member, you'll receive, that Shrees, Chandler, and a lot of people, put out, and it takes some work, but it's very helpful of capturing all the key things from the 3 different posts in Europe, and so we can see what's relevant. And now that we have these hybrid options to call in if Kaiserslautern or UK is doing something interesting to us. So next slide, please. Okay, so with that concludes our post announcements. I have one fun topic before. We have one visitor here that I think might have the longest travel distance. So Costa's here. He's coming all the way from Sofia for the presentation. So anyone here from further? If not, the prize is yours. Yeah. Okay. And then, so we're now going to cover the technical content. My goal is to maybe make it around 45 minutes of presentation, maybe a couple questions if there's time, but then to break so that people that would like to get food can go to the DFAC, bring their food in here, and then we can still have more questions or just socialize afterwards for a bit while we eat. So try to hold us to that time.
Will do.
All right, so next slide, please. Okay, so today presenting is myself again. I'm Scott Terragan. My day job is civil engineer, U.S. Army Europe and Africa, GT4 Protection, Anti-Terrorism Branch. Half my job is incorporating the anti-terrorism design standards into the new construction we're doing throughout the theater, or I definitely can't do it all myself, maintaining a trained body of people throughout the theater within the DPW office and security offices, which is the training we hosted this week. And the other half is doing assessments of existing places or places we're going to see how they meet our design standards. I'll let Akam, you introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, sure. Good afternoon or good morning. Well, good afternoon. My name is Achim Knackstedt. I'm with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and I'm the chief of the Civil and Structural section. I used to be chief of technical engineering. We just had a reorganization in our branch, so now we have the civil and structural engineers within one section, especially for ATFP compliance features. That's a pretty good development for us because we now have all engineers that work on standard and blast design and consolidate in one section. And with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, we are the construction. Yes, please.
Cannot hear you too well.
Okay.
Can you speak up a little bit?
Okay. Yes. I try. So I'm chief of the structural civil section, or civil structural section, as you like. And we have all the structural civil engineers in one section that are working on ATFP compliance reviews and designs. And within the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, we are the construction agent for all projects executed for U.S. Army and Air Force in Europe, besides the Navy portion in Italy. And so as part of that, we do the reviews and support, and I come to that later on my roles and responsibilities, but we do the review and consultants on all the ATFP aspects for projects here.
So with that insight, I guess you see why we're presenting these topics today. Yeah, but our goal is, there's many architect engineer firms, great, at least we see in attendance, hopefully also from the 40 people we have online. So we already get great products, so there is a lot of good knowledge out there, but there's always room for improvement, and especially with this theater and people coming and going in Europe, it's to get this information out every so often, especially as standards change or people come from the US where they only know the US specific design requirements because it's modified by UCOM, as we see. So the goal, though, is to, one, just kind of improve the overall quality of the AE submissions, the AT content that it incorporates, by one, explaining, giving familiarity of what the standards are, but then also explaining like what documents we are receiving from you, and to kind of set the standard of what we expect to be in there, what right looks like. So that's our goal today. Next slide, please. So to do that, I will first go over the different anti-terrorism requirement sources. So the big thing, going through the minimum AT standards, but then going on about how those minimum standards are modified by UCOM theater-specific requirements. I'll then give you a very basic overview of the facility design basis threat, because I'm sure you've heard of it with these projects, and it feeds those standards we talked about before. And then I'll cover a bit of the roles and responsibilities, and then that kind of transitions to Akam and USACE and their interaction with the AEs. So next slide, please. And requirement sources, next slide, please. So this is just a big history. So I'm not going to go through these. The point is that the 21 standards I'm going to go through, a lot of them have came from hard lessons learned. And so this is just a summary of some events over the past decades. And we see kind of the footprint of these things and lessons learned in the 21 standards we're going to talk about later. Next slide, please. And this is then an evolution of so first of all, the minimum standards for AT is UFC 41001. And its intent is simply to reduce mass casualties or minimize the likelihood of a mass casualty event. It's also then to kind of standardize the process of identifying, what are threats and what are appropriate levels of protection, so that it's standardized across DoD. It's not subjective to this person and what their idea is, and this person this idea. To standardize it, make it more economical and effective. And not just subjectivity of who's involved in the design at that time. So then there's been a long history of this standard since it first came out, starting around the 1999, the first kind of version of them. But the big thing we've seen changing throughout is standoff distance. So at first it was just a blanket 25 meters and 45 meters. Some people still remember that or still even think that's the case. But then they changed the standoff distance. And sorry, for people very unfamiliar, standoff distance is the space you need from your building to any roadways or parking, because cars are an easy way to carry very large bombs that can do, significant damage to buildings and the people inside. So standoff distance is a big thing of these standards. But yeah, it went from the 25-45 blanket requirement to then account for, obviously, a reinforced concrete wall is stronger than a unreinforced masonry. So then accounting for standoff distance based upon your construction material. But then in 2018, there was a huge change, and the VBID, which you'll see that term later, vehicle-borne improvised explosive device, car bomb, was totally removed from the minimum AT standards. I won't get into the long history of it, but this is a document that's written in primarily for U.S. installations, and it relies on the fact of a design basis threat always happening in the beginning. So if everything happened perfectly, maybe the VBID that would be captured or should be captured is the theory. But yeah, in UCOM, they decided to not embrace this new minimum standard and have their own minimum standard supplements. Next slide. This is a summary of different applicable requirements. So you see the ones we'll cover today are in bold: the minimum AT standards, the security engineering planning manual, and then the UCOM op order. And then below that is also the Army Europe one. That's the office I work for and our regulation. Next slide, please. So getting into the minimum standards of UFC 41001. Next slide, please. All right. So first of all, if you just go to a base, it's not every building is needs to have standoff distance and needs to meet all the standards within here. The standards, the 21 standards in here, are triggered by certain things, usually related to construction. So a new building that's going to have more than 11 people in it on a predictable pattern of activity, it could be targeted, is required to incorporate these standards. But then also changes to buildings. If something's being changed from a motor pool maintenance garage, like our classroom just was in this week, then yeah, that's now becoming an inhabited building, even a high occupancy building. So change in occupancy, and then renovations to buildings, major renovations. There's a lot of information here, but just the rule of thumb is if the building's going to have more than 11 people in it, start thinking, yeah, AT standards might be applicable. And then there are exemptions. So obviously buildings with less than 11 people, also in some cases, buildings that are temporary, maybe serve some connexes outside an office building, just serving as a swing space while those existing office spaces are renovated. Things that are not routinely occupied, a classroom at a training range that's not occupied on a predictable pattern of activity. So yeah, the first part is knowing when the standard is applicable or what's exempt. Next slide, please. But the first step in all this is once you determine that these AT standards are applicable, you have to do a design basis threat. That is from this UFC 42001. This is a process that's I'll cover very briefly later, but basically establishes what are the assets, how important are they, and what are the threats, and how likely are they to attack. So every project that has AT equities, you have to do this. If you go through this process and the asset value is very low or the aggressor likelihood is very, very low, obviously there's a set quantified value for that, but if it's very low, then you don't have to do any special considerations. You just apply the minimum standards. And that's what I'm covering today, those minimum standards. But you always have to first do the design basis threat. And then if it's the minimum standards, then that's what you use. Next slide. So wasn't sure whether to present this, but I think since so many of us were familiar with the old minimum AT standards related to standoff, it was maybe value to show actually what changed. Since we're still living with the impact. But basically, as we said, it eliminated VBID as a minimum threat scenario. The idea was that if a building actually was going to be targeted, well, then it would be captured in that design basis threat process if it was happening properly, and it would be protected. But if not, if it's a very insignificant building, then it's not going to be targeted. And so it only needs to protect against collateral damage to, like if, yeah, the more attractive building down the street was being targeted, yeah, this building next to it wouldn't receive collateral damage. So that's kind of the reason behind it and the impact. Some other big changes is that progressive collapse. I'll have a slide on it if you don't know it, but it's no longer required for existing buildings. Only new construction for buildings that are over 2 stories. And then there's an appendix B and C here. Basically, that's taking all the content that used to be there for how to do standoff distance, how to make windows and doors that protect against the blast event. All that content is still in the UFC. It's just moved from the minimum standards to those appendixes. And then Appendix C has those tables, the standoff tables that you might be familiar with. What's the explosive weight? What's the construction material? What is a planning factor for standoff distance? But the impact of these changes is that, yeah, it's less forgiving for omissions and basically, it's less forgiving. Sometimes people just move through, just apply the minimum standards, and that's that. And I guess we still have some safety factor. But now if the security people are not properly involved in the beginning, or design basis threat is not being done, then the building is going to end up with very little protection, have no standoff distance, and if you don't even have standoff distance from the beginning, yeah, you can't protect it later. That is required. So yeah, it's much more important for all of us, especially the architect engineers here or the other entities we represent, to make sure these security professionals are involved in the planning process. Design phase is too late, but it still helps, but in the planning aspect. Next slide, please.
Hey, Scott.
Yeah.
For y'all, is the exemption UFC for UCOM listed in the UFC itself or in the UCOM op?
So yeah, the exemption is just in the UFC. Basically, how the UCOM op order relates is that if you've triggered applicability of AT considerations, you incorporate the UFC and also UCOM op order. But
the UFC itself says it's not applicable.
It does not, but the UFC says COCOMs have the authority to establish their own additional standards. No, but the first step of applicability is the UFC. All right, so this is just a summary of what those 21 standards are, but I'm highlighting in red the ones that are affected by the UCOM AT op order. No need to read them out, but yeah, these are the ones that are changed. Next slide, please. So these are not applicable in Europe, but I'm just showing because, yeah, to show I guess the contrast, the difference. But since the 2018 publication, the UFC alone, yeah, it only requires, yeah, this basically standoff to be anywhere from 6 meters to 15 meters to your installation perimeter, depending on what's outside that perimeter line, but yeah, as little as 6 meters. And pretty much there's no standoff distance required from your buildings to internal roadways or parking. And by internal, I mean within an access controlled installation. And then there used to be special considerations for if you had an access road, like a DFAC needs to have deliveries coming directly to it, even if that's standoff. There used to be requirements for how you control that access road. But those restrictions were also then eliminated. Next slide, please. It's one off. Okay, so there's a lag. Okay, so then also just like it affected like those siting conditions, it also affected some of the materials that protect. So windows used to have to be specifically designed. With this thing, the 2018 change, that just gives a minimum prescription. 6 millimeter laminated window is enough to give collateral damage protection. If a bomb goes off down the street, your glass will break, but the overpressure there will be so low that just a very small, laminate thin window will, reduce some of that flying glass that you see in the bottom left photo. And similar topic for doors. They removed these special design considerations. Next slide. Okay, so this is how the UCOM AT op order modified it. This is kind of just an extract of what's in the op order. I don't want to dwell into it because it's just a lot of boring text. And you see I omitted any explosive waste because it's a bit controlled information. But if you have the need to know and you're working on our projects, we share with you the AT op order and you have those design considerations. So first of all, the UCOM AT op order establishes what the threat delivery vehicle is and the size of it, but more importantly, the weight of it, so that if you have barriers, you know what kinetic energy you need to design them to. So it establishes what the weight is, and then it establishes the explosive weights of that threat. So based upon your access control procedures, how small the thing they're searching for, based upon a building's proximity to the perimeter or to internal roads and parkings. It gives two different explosive weights to design for. But then the big thing here is then designing for that bomb to be either a stationary VBID or moving VBID. Stationary means the person wants to park in a legal parking spot, walk away unnoticed, go on throughout their day, and the VBID goes off and they're unrelated to it. Moving means that if the person has created a VBID, they're happy to, give their life or get in trouble, in the delivery of it. They're not going to restrict themselves to legal parking spots. So they will drive up a road that says, authorized vehicles only, or they will drive over the curb and get their VBID to their target. So that's what the difference between stationary and moving VBID. So all buildings, all inhabited buildings, that are triggering these AT standards have to account for a stationary VBID. So that means all of your buildings are going to have all these inhabited buildings have to have standoff distance. When you do the design basis threat process, if it turns out it's very low level of protection is required, you just leave it as stationary. That means you just have the standoff distance, and that's it. You don't need any kind of barriers. But then if your building requires a low level of protection or higher, or if the building has more than 50 occupants, you need to enforce that standoff distance with barriers. So that means a building will require a perimeter of passive barriers, like stationary barriers, to prevent a vehicle from, driving over the curb or getting to that building, or if you have access roads, an active barrier. And it also specifies the levels of protection as well against those threats as either very low or low. Next slide, please. So again, the impact now from having to account for stationary and or moving VBIDs is we have to have standoff distance. Often we have to have barriers, and now our windows and wall materials need to be specifically designed for those VBIDs at whatever that standoff distance we provide is. So that's why we use that Appendix B that I was mentioning that still has all that good design guidance in it. And then Appendix C gives tables of standoff distances for explosive weights and wall materials. So if you do have a moving VBID threat, so a building over 50 people or a building that for its asset value requires a low level of protection or higher, you also have to have active barriers. The active barriers do need to be rated for that specific vehicle's kinetic energy, based upon the roadway geometries leading to it, but they do not need to be on the DoD anti-ram vehicle barrier list. That list we still use that for selecting our access control point barriers, our final denial barriers, but just for the facility protection, they need to be rated. They can be rated to the the European systems they have here, but they don't need to be on that list. And then the passive barriers, they do not need to be specifically rated. They need to be designed kind of, for that expected vehicle and to provide some kind of stopping capability, but they do not need to be certified rated if the building's protection requirement is medium or less. But they must comply with specifications from UCOM for height, embedment, spacing, or for example, weight if you're using things like boulders. Next slide, please. So this is just showing those same 4 standards I showed you earlier, but now for standoff distance, unobstructed space, and the access roads, but now accounting for the the UCOM AT orders. So seeing that we have standoff, I don't have a pointer, but on the measurement kind of shown to the right, showing standoff distance consideration just from a building to parking or roadways within a controlled perimeter. But yeah, you also have to account for what's out there on the outside of the controlled perimeter that anything can come to. And then that often has a different standoff requirement. So 2 different standoff requirements. Your unobstructed space, you can't have any bushes or things where people could conceal IEDs within an area near the building. So that whole distance of your standoff distance to your parkway, say it's 16 meters, that's called your unobstructed space, and yeah, it needs to be clear of things to hide IEDs. And then also, if you have access roads to that building going inside your standoff distance, there are specific, you need to enforce it with barriers, active barriers. Next slide, please. This is showing one of those standoff tables from Appendix C I was mentioning. So as an example, if it's Unreinforced European clay masonry, which is common here, non-load bearing wall against a 25 kilogram IED. By this table, you might only need 7 meters of standoff distance from that wall to your parking to provide a low level of protection. This is just a planning guide. Actually, if you have a lot of windows and you have less wall area, responding to the load, you actually might need more, but it's a planning guide. But regardless, you see 7 meters there, but yeah, the weakest link controls. You see the windows down there, a typical window is going to require 15 meters. So yeah, it's not just the walls, also account for the windows, but in theater, the windows that we can get from manufacturers and the analysis that Occam's team's done, yeah, usually 16 meters is the minimum distance to have an economical window. That's a good rule of thumb to keep in mind. 16 meters when you're siting buildings to any roadways or parking. Next slide, please. All right, so we had to count for standoff, we had to count for wall materials, and then windows. So yeah, we cannot use the prescribed window within the UFC, that 6 millimeter laminate window. Windows need to be individually designed based upon the standoff provided and the threat size IED, and in order to fail in one of these safe blue or green zones, depending on your level of protection. That's basically showing the projection of glass throughout the room and the different hazards. But our windows are specifically designed, not using the prescription of the UFC. Next slide, please. This is just showing what a laminate window is, in case you don't know. So on the left is a typical insulated glass unit window, 2 panes, and the inner pane has a laminate there. So if the pane fails, kind of like a car windshield, the window breaks, but all the glass fragment is held together, bonded on that laminate, and not projected into the room. Because this middle image is kind of showing the typical European window that opens, but then also tilts, because these windows are often in open position. UCOM also requires these windows to have both the inner pane as typical and the outer pane made of laminate glass, but these are available from the local manufacturers. And then it's not just the laminate that's important, but then that laminate, that's what's holding the window in the frame. So that has specific anchoring requirements into the frame itself. But then the frame also has certain anchoring requirements you see in the bottom right into the wall. All that load has to be passed into the structure. And then is the wall even strong enough to absorb that load if it's weak old masonry? Next slide, please. Yeah, please.
I'm sorry, one ahead note. So the tilt windows are also tested in tilt position. So it's not only that the exterior pane is laminated, also like the mechanism that holds the window in the tilt position is tested for that load.
Okay, so this is just maybe the UCOM specific considerations just shown in a real world application. I don't have a pointer, but we can see there that the building to any roadways and parking, there is this standoff distance of green space and unobstructed space, no big things there to conceal an IED. And then we do see an access road that goes to the front of it, but what you can't see so on the image is that there are active barriers there controlling the access as needed. And then the perimeter you also cannot see, but around where the parking all is, where you don't have the access lane, they're stationary passive barriers enforcing that standoff distance, so someone can't pass through there. And then glazing exterior doors are also captured. Next slide, please. So again, a summary of all of the standards, all 21 of them, and I've already given you a good run through, I think, of the 4 that were revised by the UCOM AT op order. The green ones are changed and different. Since this might be new content for all of you, I'll go through some quickly, just bullet by bullet, not individual slides, what these different standards are. Let's look at number 5 on the left. Yeah, you can't park beneath buildings or not on rooftops. Because obviously it's just the easy way to introduce an ID there. Progressive collapse resistance, as we hinted on earlier, new buildings over 2 stories still require to be designed to resist progressive collapse. I'll have a slide for that if you don't know. But there's also consideration for structural isolation, building overhangs and breezeways. You should not have them. They're a nice architectural feature, but they can capture and even make greater the explosive loading. If you have exterior masonry walls, there's minimum reinforcement requirements specified there, so that they don't fail as hazardously. We already talked about glazing. Number 11, building entrance layout.
Let me
Go
just
ahead.
add a note on that. So the exterior masonry walls is like the UFC is like a US requirement, right? And it requires reinforced masonry, like concrete masonry unit. Those are not available here in Europe. That's why we
Yeah.
normally fall back on reinforced concrete walls here.
Okay, building entrance layout. So you should orient any doorways facing the interior of the perimeter so they're not exposed to direct fire weapons from the perimeter. Exterior doors, that's like their blast rating, the same thing, so they don't fail and project into the room in a hazardous way. Mail rooms and loading docks, since obviously they're receiving vehicles and potential threats, there's special considerations for where you locate them relative to the overall building, perhaps in the corner of a building away from any mass gathering areas within that building. Roof access, you need to prevent it, or if you have it secured. And then I have another slide for 15, so I'll skip that. 16, so HVAC systems, your fresh air intakes, they need to be located at least 3 meters off the ground so that people cannot introduce contaminants into there. The ventilation systems for mailrooms and loading docks, same thing, because they are more likely to receive hazards or things. They have special requirements for shutting off, having separate ventilation systems and the ability to shut it off. That way, if something happens in the mailroom, it doesn't spread throughout the rest of the building population. But in general, the entire building of these buildings are required to have emergency air distribution shutoff switches for the users. So should there be an event, inside the building because something else was discovered, or some kind of event outside the building, the air stops circulating, and you can do your shelter procedures. 19, I'll cover on another slide. Should not have any access to get under the building. Same reason, it just provides an avenue of attack. And mass notification system. Our buildings are required to have a way to give all the occupants real-time information of other threats and presence and instructions on what to do. So buildings are required to provide that as well. Next slide, please. So just a little detail of progressive collapse you may know, but it's just an event where you have disproportionate damage. One member fails, but you have overloading of failure and much higher damage as a result. Most of us recognize the building in Oklahoma City was the big lesson learned of it. So required for buildings 3 stories and higher. Next slide, please. And then 2 of these things, overhead mounted items or infrastructure equipment that's mounted overhead. If it's over 14 kilograms, it requires special mounting and design requirements so that it doesn't fail in a blast event where things are loaded in different ways or laterally, and then the way it wasn't originally designed for, and then failing and becoming a hazard like we see in this Brussels airport bombing. Next slide, please. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the EUCOM AT op order again. I already went through the design changes to it, how they changed the UFC. The only thing I'd like to highlight that's here is, all of our installations by EUCOM are required to have at least 1 engineer trained in security engineering. So if you're doing a project at USAG Ansbach, there should be at least 1 knowledgeable person there on these standards that should be engaged with your project and helping and doing these design reviews. For Ansbach, I think we had 4 people there actually today. And then one thing for you to know, I think also helpful for the AEs, is the difference between the facility design basis threat, which we'll talk later. This is a document that's governed by these UFCs. You do it once in the planning phase of a project, and it exists for that project, for that building's lifetime as is. But another thing that's similar is called a local DBT or a installation DBT. This is a annual live capture of what the perceived threats are, and that affects how the garrison plans its own security. So that document certainly should feed the facility design basis threat when you're doing it, but they're not the same. You can't use one for the other. Next slide, please. Okay, so applying the minimum standards to new construction can be more straightforward, but to existing construction, there can be a lot of gray areas and complications. So EUCOM, through the help of USACE, did develop a good amount of implementing guidance for things like when we're doing building additions. Of that addition, what has to incorporate AT standards? What has to incorporate also these new barrier systems? Is it just the addition, or is it the full building? Also, if you're renovating windows, window replacement, like a single one or a batch of them, there's like a 10% threshold then. There's, sorry, can you go back to the, okay. And then the big thing, especially in Europe, where our bases are quite constrained with space, if all of a sudden we're renovating a building, and since its whole history, there's been parking and roadways next to it, well, we're allowed to, I think it's still the next slide, please. Yeah. So we are allowed to, when triggering these requirements to provide the level of protection, we're allowed to eliminate parking, but not necessarily allowed to eliminate roadways. So there's quite a few detailed nuances in the standards to read for how to apply in these unique situations. Also give some guidance, if not new construction, but just mitigation type things, if you're using retention film or blast curtains, things to do, and specific ballistic protection requirements for any guard booth facilities, like at an access control point. That's above the minimum standards. Next slide, please. All right. Just know that there's some other standards out there. The Army Europe regulation doesn't really add too many new procedures. It's more kind of a user guide to the anti-terrorism officers about how to manage all these different standards. And it does give a theory. Instead of trying to have barriers around every building, let's be smart from the area development plans. Let's create some like pedestrian zones, and then just have a holistic kind of barrier plan and not just around every individual building. There's a UFC on access control points, but the Army also has its own standard for it. So I think that's relevant for you to know that exists and to also reference. And then schools are big projects over here. DODEA has its own similar, like you recognize the number 41001, like their own standard, and it's 36 standards of physical security and anti-terrorism criteria. Some are very similar from the ATUFC, but some are uniquely their own. So know that these exist and reference them when they're relevant for your projects. Next slide, please. This is the design basis threat. I'm going to go through these really fast because all I want you to know is, I'm sure you probably heard of the term. It's the first step as soon as a project comes to conception and starts planning, this needs to be done because it establishes what's the appropriate threat, what's the appropriate level of protection. And yeah, then that gets captured in your planning documents. That affects the funding you get. Yeah, but these need to happen in the beginning, and yeah, you should be getting these from the installation. So it's all governed by this UFC 42001, and Chapter 3 describes it step by step. So I'm just giving you an overview to know it exists, know where it comes from. It's not just some magical thing out or a super classified document that's out there. Next slide, please. These are the steps. I kind of just went through them verbally. So next step. Next slide, sorry. So basically, first of all, you're establishing what are your assets in the building and determining how important they are. So on the right, at the very end, you get your asset value. So there's going to be many assets within a building. This is just one asset, for example, and you get your asset value. That basically drives what your level of protection will be. So that's a pretty high one. So you're going to have probably a higher level of protection, which I'll explain what that means later. Next slide, please. So, for example, if a building has a VBIED threat, maybe it's okay for the building to be very damaged, like that top photo on the right, as long as there's not a mass casualty event. Maybe some local injuries are right at, but the building's not collapsed, will not be mass casualties. Or maybe people, like the bottom right, you will see way less damage. Maybe people shouldn't even leave their desk. They need to keep working, through any kind of event. That's the difference between like a low level of protection and a high level of protection. And that's based upon your asset value that dictates, how your building will respond to whatever threat you have. Next slide. And then this even defines what a medium level of protection is, as I kind of illustrated to you. So yeah, how the building performs, how the glass performs, and the types of human injuries that can be expected. Next slide, please. So once you figure out how important the asset is and what kind of level of protection it needs, then what are all the aggressors? So in the blue box, who are all the aggressors? And how likely are they to attack based upon their operational capabilities, based upon the availability of that target, that specific one. Then you get your aggressor likelihood on the right. Again, how likely are they to attack? Next slide. And then you go through this other table and basically, the highest controls, and you end up with all of these threat tactics. So like I have stationary VBIED highlighted in yellow, the highest controls, which anyway is only L's. So then your design basis threat is low against it. You don't need to know it, just know this is the process for the end result, which we give you. Next slide. But yeah, what is a low design basis threat? Well, there's another table within that UFC that explains what a low is. And in this, there it is. Next slide, please. Okay, so that UFC 42001 that goes through what of all our threats and protections are, yeah, it has not been updated since 2008. Obviously, there's new threats out there. This is just to illustrate one we're all well aware of now. Small UAVs, commercial UAVs weaponized with just a 40 millimeter grenade. And yeah, the damage it can do. This is a not from this specific threat, but a similar type thing. 20 centimeter concrete roof slab representative. So yeah, significant hazards, lie that are not captured on protection documents. The point is, when you're doing these design-based threat shreds and capturing your threats, yeah, you can incorporate your own things in there as well. Next slide. That's showing damage to concrete. This is showing damage from a window pane. You see on the top left, the glass, just a jet stream extending 10, 20 meters there, and the size of the glass shards on the right that were projected all the way 10 meters into what would be a room. Next slide, please. Then chapter 3 does the process for how to do the design basis threat. Chapter 4 then tells you how to protect against. So for example, if you do the process and for a direct fire weapon was identified as a threat, if your required level of protection is a low, all you have to do is block the sight lines. So that's things orienting your doorways to not face the perimeter, or having some tint on the windows so people can't, do direct, target within a building. But if it's a high level of protection, you actually need to harden all your building elements, the walls and windows. And so you might, need this type of 4-inch concrete to resist that type of bullet. So next slide, please. This is just showing how AT is captured through the whole design life. So in planning, that's when you do the design basis threat. And then that design basis threat then goes into your planning document. For example, for Milcon, your DD 1391. So that's all captured in the planning phase. Then in design, of course, the designer takes it and incorporates it to design. People are reviewing design, making sure it's being designed as was planned and required. And then, yeah, staying on top of construction so it's properly built. Similarly, area development plans are also an important time for AT, because there you get these holistic site concepts where if a building's going to require a lot of deliveries, don't put on the backside of the installation where the building, a sewage truck or these unvetted trucks might need to drive past barracks every day. Put those buildings closer to the access control point. And also, you can establish what your general level of protection is for typical buildings inside to help you with siting. Next slide. And then, so these are some of the roles. So as your AEs are working with the garrison staff, know that every installation usually has an anti-terrorism officer, and they're the ones that we hold like directly responsible for making sure these get correctly incorporated. But they're usually not an engineer background. They've been to security engineering training and they have some basic awareness. But yeah, they might not even know how to read engineering drawings. But there's someone you need to know. Same thing, physical security officer for things like the fences. Anti-terrorism is going to cover the standoff distance, all those things we talked about. But physical security officer is going to get things like perimeter security or locks and cameras. That's the kind of person you talk to for that. There's usually a chief of protection that also has some type of role with them. And then every DPW engineer has to have a security engineering trained person, like an actual engineer. Other relationships, the higher headquarters, like within the staff, they also have sometimes input because they're also responsible for force protection. So someone like Fifth Corps, and then also, yeah, our office at U.S. Army Europe and Africa. Some other major players are the European USACE district that has structural engineers that are involved in the planning, design reviews, and then you all, the AEs, who are capturing those design requirements into our projects. Next slide, please. I'll skip this for sake of time, but basically just saying, yeah, it's a lot of different people, holistic design. This you can click later when it's just showing some resources for understanding what threat might be, but also some reference manuals. And then, yeah, this is the SharePoint page. If you have a CAC, you can access it. If not, email me and we'll figure it out. But yeah, you can come to this site for all the references like the AT op order or software to help you do the design basis threat, news about upcoming trainings, and to find out who different points of contacts are at USAG Ansbach, who just had security engineering training and can be your contact. Next slide, please. All right. And so I went over the requirement sources, like in general. what the minimum standards are, how they're modified by Europe, and how our minimum standards are additional, what the design basis threat is, and then some of the different roles and responsibilities for AT, throughout the chain of command. Next slide, please. All right, so this is my information. Feel free to contact me. And I have one question as I transition over. Did anyone plan to eat lunch at the DFAC? No? Okay, then you don't need to worry so much about time then. So 20 minutes is enough for you, Akam?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
You want to answer a question in your presentation first?
Yeah, does anyone have any questions on the content I put forth? Yep.
Sharice.
Question. Do you see any difference between the services? The way
Yeah.
this is applied, Army, Air Force, the way they do the GBT, or
Yeah.
the way they
So the requirements here are not U.S. Army Europe's
Right.
requirements. They're not Army requirements. They're from DoD and UCOM. So that is what needs to be done. And yeah, I'm doing my best that we and all of our staff at the theater is doing it that way. But yes, I'm aware that sometimes it seems that other services are not doing it, and these things should be then captured because UCOM comes and audits us. They want to see, what projects have AT equities, and there's a lot of other stuff they require from us, documentation on it. And yeah, so they should be getting in trouble in their own inspection programs that when UCOM comes to them, and then things should be corrected. But yeah, I think we're doing perhaps a better job than some of the other services on it.
So we have a question from the chat from David Dieter. When does the blast shock wave standoff analysis come into play versus 41001 table standoff?
David, are you able to speak?
I am.
I'm not sure what you mean by the blast shockwave standoff analysis. Sounds like a certain product.
I think I understand. I think you're asking, we're doing the blast design versus just going by the table. For most of the projects we do, where we use a blast design, we always do blast design, because if you look at the tables for a masonry wall, they just show you a masonry wall which has like no opening, and it's like a standardized wall, which you not always get here. You not always know what the compressive strength is, but the main thing is, as soon as you have an opening in the wall, then that table is just for planning purposes. I think as Scott mentioned in his presentation. So you can use it for planning, but if you have like every meter a window, then the piece between those windows gets a much higher load than what's reflected in those standoff tables.
And then another question online. Do we know how this applies to facilities delivered using host nation funding? I'm thinking PPI specifically, but we may have other such situations.
Yeah, that's a question which maybe I didn't cover in the applicability, but yeah, these are required for any building that's hosting DoD personnel. And DoD personnel is military, civilian, and even our local nationals and contractors. So it doesn't matter who's providing the building, who's paying for it. If it's hosting US DoD, it's required to provide this level of protection. I think in PPI, it's been a bit easier.
So in the ABCA,
Yeah.
PPI is
Yeah.
written specifically that they will meet all US.
Yeah. I think for these Polish projects, because there has been so much documentation and formal agreements, it's been easier. But yeah, maybe other cases where we're just occupying a building in a country, in a different country that, we're provided a space. It's not as easy to get these standards accounted for.
Yes, Scott, you indicated that for new construction,
Mhm.
any building that has 11 or greater, just want clarification, 11 or greater personnel in it.
Yep.
Will require that minimum spend operation.
If they're there on a predictable pattern of activity, yes.
And that's considered the high occupancy or?
No.
Because high occupancy I saw earlier was 50 plus.
Yeah. So the AT standards are triggered at more than 11 people. Where the 50 plus comes in is that's from the UCOM standard of if a building needs to just have standoff distance and protect or barriers enforcing the standoff distance.
Like if you would go by old UFCs before 2018, you would always distinguish between inhabited facility and primary gathering. That went away with 2018, but it came back with EUCOM OPOD just for the moving vehicle threat consideration.
I just have a warehouse that's not going to be occupied. Stick that anywhere. Yeah. No, there's, yeah. Except for the physical security standoff, right? Yeah, and there's some like, yeah, and there's like fire distances as well. But yeah, but speaking of the warehouse, even because warehouses, so there's 11 people, but there's also a density aspect to it too. So if you had a huge building, a warehouse with 20 people, but it's so large, it's less than, who was just in the class? What's the square meter density? 4 meter or 40? Yeah,
40.
Yeah, one person per 4 square meters, then yeah, it also affects your applicability. So an empty building. Yeah. Yeah, I can go in. No AT standards.
I think a good example on that is an aircraft hangar where the admin portion would be occupied, but the aircraft hangar, even 20 people are working there, is unoccupied because of the density. Low occupied, not unoccupied.
Anything else in the chat?
Nope.
Okay. Yeah, turn it over to Akam. We'll get.
Okay, let me just start my computer. I need save battery here.
So my goal was to just explain, what the basic standards and requirements are. And now Akam's going to get more into the.
Yeah. I go to the, after all the fancy stuff, I come to the boring things now. So again, my name is Achim Knackstedt, and this is kind of wrong information. So I'm not chief of technical engineering anymore. I'm chief of structural civil. So now I mainly cover all the ATFP application for our projects. If you could go next slide, please. So what I want to talk about today is, I need to go to the next slide as well, I guess, about roles and responsibilities on projects, about expectations, and what we expect from A&E on the execution of those projects, and also I want to address some issues or items for improvement we run into when we execute those projects. So on this first slide is like the expectations and goals, what we have on projects and also on the A&Es. Like, I guess our main goal is we want to provide designs that comply with all the standards Scott just explained to all of us. And our expectation for an A&E under USAC AE scope of work is that our AE is knowledgeable in all these ATFP standards and can apply them UFC and EUCOM OPOD, and that the A&E is capable in running blast design calculations as needed, and not only running them, also understanding them and interpret them. Like if you run SBETS calculations, that's a blast software for Windows, you would need to understand that you cannot use a negative phase when you design Windows and things like that. We expect that from the A&E running those calculations. And obviously we expect that the A&E would understand how to specify those components such as Windows. Next slide, please.
Akin, one question.
Sure.
Is there any place where AEs can receive training on SBEDS?
Well, the Corps of Engineers provides SBEDS training. I'm not 100% sure if they allow us, but you have best.
Yeah, I can answer. So actually,
you know one?
Yeah, the USACE Protective Design Center, they give a blast resistant structural design course, and as part of that, they teach SBEDS, and yes, AEs are welcome to attend for a fee, just like everyone else.
Yeah, and we, for example, yeah. Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, and it's quite good course. I've recently been in SOAPs. Staff.
And we also, like at the Corps of Engineers, we also ask the PDC to provide classes just for us. Like next week, we invite a SBEDS trainer from the PDC. We provide them with funding. They call in and give us like online training,
right.
Through virtual training on SBEDS.
So maybe an AE can request the same.
I would think so.
Yeah,
that's a good question. Yeah, excellent. All right.
But also, just to add to that, I think in the US, you have opposite to offices in Germany, a lot of specialized offices that do know all this software.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Next slide. So, louder? Louder. Okay, louder. So this one, is on USAC roles and responsibilities. And I bring this up just to provide the difference between what our role is on projects with the German government, our role is on AE projects. So our role on projects with the German government, we call indirect projects, is intense. Per ABG 75, the host nation AE to the German government is not supposed to know, they don't have to know all the US regulations. And that's where we come in, and we have to provide detailed applicable code requirements. And for ATFP, we come in, we interpret the DBT, and we provide an ATFP assessment in which we lay out all the details, all the standard requirements. We address the EUCOM OPOD for them. And later during design, we actually run the aspects calculations for the German AE. So the AE gives us the structural system, we run the aspects calculations, and we tell them it's good or you need to add reinforcement, etc. And then we review their design documents against the assessment we provide. So that's on indirect projects. And if you could go to the next slide on direct projects, we don't have this through the German government ABG 75. We have a contract directly with A&E, and there our role is more limited, right? We prepare the AE scope of work, we identify the project scope requirements, and then later we review the design against the AE scope of work. Right? We obviously in charrettes and meetings we support code interpretation, but we don't have this role we have on the indirect process where we have to lay it all out. We support the garrisons on DBT assessments if they request. Again, that's not our main responsibility; it's the ATO's responsibility. But we do support. But we don't provide that ATFP assessment as we do on the indirect ABG 75 side. And just a note here, when I talk ATFP assessment, that's not DBT. DBT is what Scott prepared, where they define the threat. ATFP is like assessment is like how we mitigate the threat, what we do during construction or in the design. Next slide, please. So this is an extract from our AE scope of work, from our AE scope of work template, and this is then what our expectation is from AE design on ATFP. So it's like two things two things plus everything in the execution document, right? But it's an ATFP site plan, and site plan that clearly shows all ATFP features in one drawing. That's a separate drawing. The unobstructed space, the standoff distance, the active barriers, the passive barriers, etc. We also ask for an ATFP compliance narrative, so that demonstrates how does this design meet the UFC and the EUCOM OPOD. It lays out what's required and how the standards are met. You know, it implements the DBT, what explosive weights are applicable, and how it's all addressed. Standoff distance, blast resistant windows. If it's more than 3-story building, it will have a progressive collapse calculations, etc. It will have dynamic analysis as it's needed. Next slide, please. This is just a sample site plan from a direct project with approval from EUCOM. That's from the Baumholder Lodge. That's a pretty good example, like what we want to see. Like it shows the standoff zone, it shows the unobstructed space, it shows the rated barriers, it shows the passive barriers, so all information consolidated on one drawing.
I was going to say, from my perspective, it's also really useful that it's, I don't know what the decision is to do it like that, but especially like the ATOs or people that are less familiar with reading engineering drawings, for them to have one document where it's all located and not have to go through different site plans, big table of contents. It's very helpful.
So this is not necessarily a construction document. So the contractor would not necessarily need this. This is for the ATO for USAC to make sure it's all there. And we have this requirement not only on direct projects, we have it also on indirect projects through the German government. So the next slide is like typical random issues we find when we review documents. So sometimes we don't see that compliance narrative, or it's incomplete, or we don't have an ATFP site plan. It's all spread out across the civil, the structural, and the architectural drawings. Then third bullet is what happens is we attend charrettes and we talk and we make decisions, and then we receive the concept design and things look different. And we are wondering where this is coming from. So this is something we want to bring up today. Not sure what's happening. Is there unclarity, documentation, misunderstanding? But I think what's important is that we communicate well during the charrette, after the charrette, make sure we all agree on what has been discussed. And if something happens between the charrette and the concept design, there's always a point of contact from our team in the charrette who is responsible for ATFP. So please work with us, ask us, contact us, like discuss issues. If something is not clear from the charrette, please. It's better to discuss it first before it comes to the 35% design, and we review it, and we are wondering where all the agreements are gone, all right? Yeah, EUCOM OPAD is something we see in some designs that it's not considered as it should be, especially what Scott pointed out, that the minimum requirements don't apply, the 6 meter standoff doesn't apply, the parking in unobstructed space doesn't apply. So we had charrettes where we saw drawings that don't consider the EUCOM OPAD, that we have to go to Appendix B, and we had parking within unobstructed space, and then we were asked by the designer if they can have that EUCOM OPAD from us. But we, as I said before, we expect the designer to know that and to understand that. So same next bullet, same thing. Window specs is sometimes an issue that it's not complete. In window specs is always the performance. What does a window have to do? Like the minimum hazard or the low hazard, the load, like the blast pressure, and then the technical requirements, like how it has to be designed and tested, etc. That all needs to be in one specs. And the last one, sometimes we see that when we have existing buildings, that the design shows wall strengthening to support the windows without analyzing the walls before. That's like adding costs. So we would analyze the walls before we strengthen walls. Or sometimes they're not analyzed and just connected, which is also not good. So they need to be the walls need to be verified if they can support the load of the window. So this is what USACE support, what we provide. Obviously, we can consult on ATFP code interpretation as needed. Always feel free to contact us if there's anything unclear. We can provide reachback support to the PDC if they have something above and beyond what we understand or we can do. We can provide ATFP Windows specs template, which I will show later. USACE can provide the SBET software. That's through the PDC website. You go to the website and you apply for it. I think as an A&E, you need to provide a specific project, and they would come to us and we would confirm that you work on that project, and then you would get the software. And we can provide codes and standards. I think the last thing I have is the next slide. So this is the a window guideline we prepared for developing specification for ATFP compliant windows. So what this is like the first page is like a general background information about what it's all about, what codes apply, level of protection, etc. But then when it comes to the second page, this page, lower right, it starts with technical contract requirements. And then everything that's highlighted in green, the designer needs to edit. and that's like level of protection, etc. If you could go to the next slide. So there's a lot of stuff in green, but it's not as much work as it looks. You just delete what's not applicable and overwrite the applicable level of protection. And then if you could go to the next slide, please. So then in this table, you would provide the applicable blast load for all the elevations of your facility for the windows. And when that's done, this portion can be copied directly into the specification. So everything you see after the window box here, this is all specs text talking about testing requirements, minimum glazing requirements, submittal requirements, contractor qualification. So it's all in there. It's just one copy paste specs package you can use. I think we are providing that for projects also.
It's very useful.
And these are our HFP PSCs, myself and Dan Rosha. He's our lead structural engineer, SME, working in the structural civil section. And I think that's all I had. What I did have, I have this one, a sample from the ATFP narrative, if you want to share that. And
can I ask one question?
Sure.
So the spec language that you just showed, and maybe even the site plan, is that so it's shared through the slide, but can we already share that document as we share the slides? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Maybe so they can have it as its own attachment?
Yeah, I can send that to you.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Sure.
we
Yeah,
can,
we'll make that available. Okay. I just had one comment, maybe, or did you want to go through this, Bucky? Go ahead.
Well, it's just, we talked about ATFP narrative, and I just want to show how that looks like. Again, I copied that from your project. So at the beginning, it talks about the background, but if you could scroll down a little bit, I want to show you, it kind of addresses like each standard Scott pointed out in his presentation and how it's addressed in this project. So that's a pretty good sample, and that's the expectation we have, and
and it's not just your subjectivity that is its expectation; it's required from, right?
Well,
that's the narrative, right?
That's what I put this. But this is something which was required in the UFC before 2018,
yeah.
And we just kept it because we think it's a good thing to do.
Yeah. Okay.
Just one point that you made came about how there can be misunderstanding, unclarity between the charrette meeting and then the first concept. Maybe just to provide a little bit of context for that, the AEs, when they produce their charrettes, it goes through a big cycle of review. Mm-hmm. And because some of these things may be considered subjective, I'm sure that introduces an element of misunderstanding, which is one reason why we had today's presentation, is to hopefully make some progress on some minimum standards and get minimum understanding of what needs to be included in those types of designs. So thanks for that. Excellent input. Okay. Any other questions from the group or online? We have a question. Is this part of the UFGS, Unified Facilities Guide specifications?
And when you say this means
the window spec,
probably the window spec. Is that
no, this is something we developed here for Europe. This is something you like on direct projects. We don't really use UFGS specs in Europe, just for security related projects. So we use a host nation based specs.
Yeah.
And I think we had a semi presentation on that like
a few
months ago,
yes.
Right? So we use host nation based specs, or we use the VOB specs for the indirect projects, and that's where you can add it under the line item for Windows. So it's not UFGS.
Okay.
So this chapter, this specs we developed in-house.
Right.
Yeah.
Specs were developed in-house. Yep. Okay, great. Thanks.
Scott, my boss, Phil Gaffney's about to get the FY24 plan approved. And so the first thing I'm going to do is send that to you, and I'm going to get a bunch of DBTs back so we can start the planning.
Yeah, that's what happens in the plan. Yeah, all the inhabited buildings. Yep.
Well, as the representative of programs for the Rhine-Main Post, I would just like to say a huge thank you, Scott, to you and Akim for
Okay.
presenting this. This really embraces the spirit of SAME and what we're trying to do by bringing government and industry together. And today is an excellent example of that. Thank you for all the time and energy you put into your very informative presentation. We really appreciate it. I would give you a coin, but I think you have multiple coins. So what I can say is I hope you join the holiday special, a special invitation to you, Akim, and we'll be able to show you a good time there. In any case, that wraps up the program portion of our meeting today. So thank you, everybody, for coming out. Any final words, Scott?
No, you said it well.
All right.
Thanks, everyone, for your interest and time.
Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you, you too.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, everybody.